There's no easy solution, and most outcomes that are out there are either unacceptable or just undoable. So one thing I wanted to point out is that the UN is often dismissed because it's had so many peacekeeping disasters, really, where there wasn't already a peace to keep. So in areas where there's it's been tough and where there's still fighting and where the people are still armed, it doesn't have a great record, but it has actually managed to do it on at least one occasion. And the question, what makes it sort of interesting is the reasons why it worked that time. So the occasion was during the wars in Yugoslavia. And you may remember that in 1991, the war began really in Croatia. The Serbs won, in effect, and they assumed control over areas that were primarily Serb or partially Serb populated. And then for several years, they were in charge of those places. The rebel forces were in charge. And in the eastern part of Croatia, known as Eastern Slavonia, there was a town there called Vukovar, which was sort of famous at the time as a kind of this sort of Croatia's Stalingrad. Similarly to what's happening in Gaza, the place was absolutely flattened. There were heavy civilian casualties. So at the end of that, it became clear that the balance of forces had changed. So you needed somehow to make a transition from a Serb-held area where the ethnic Croats had all been ethnically cleansed, essentially. You needed to get a transition to Croatian control again and to return Croats. And so a very difficult proposition. The UN had multiple disasters in Bosnia, etc., where two weak forces with vague mandates had ended up failing to protect people, thousands killed as a result. So the UN finally, wanted to get this one right. And so they put in a force that was really heavily armed. They had, two mechanized battalions, so tanks, APCs, etc. They had a unit, a squadron of Ukrainian helicopter gunships. And so they moved into this area. They had an agreement ahead of time to say, okay, this is going to be a transition. It'll take 1 to 2 years. This is what we're going to do. They moved in heavily armed, around 5,000 troops, and it worked. It actually worked. You had a UN administrator who was actually American, so one after the other, two diplomats, American diplomats, and that gave comfort to the Croatians that this thing ultimately would work out as it was supposed to. You had Russian troops on the ground, as well as various other countries, and the Russian troops gave comfort to the Serbs that they would be taken care of, they wouldn't end up being killed. And then you had other troops there who gave comfort to the returning Croats. So it was a carefully put together force.
Mark, that was not a long-term solution though, right? That was a short-term solution at this point. So there's still, if let's say that model does work, what ends up happening to the Palestinians, not just who live in Gaza, but also in the West Bank?
Well, that was the key thing. So, the point of that was it was an international transition force. So you need to have an arrangement that goes from A to B. And the B in that case was Croatian control. So the B in this case probably should be the Palestinian Authority being put in charge with an administration. It might have to be a longer transition. It might have to be a lot longer. But the point is that you need to figure out, how you're going to end this thing, agree ahead of time how it's going to be done, and then the force goes in, and you need to sort of compose it so that for Gazans there will be enough trust, for the Israelis there'll be enough trust, and make it happen. It's extremely difficult, but it has actually been done.
I mean, you have to. You can't rely on the existing leadership or folks that you believe to be in charge or possibly in charge at this point, right? It has to be a different entity and organization at this point. And even allies of different, everybody's got something that they want ultimately out of it. So you really have to remove it in order for there to be a different outcome, right?
Yeah, I think it would be almost impossible to do with the current leaderships. There's certainly Hamas has to go. And then, it can't be allowed to govern. The Israelis made that very clear, and it's understandable and correct. So then the question then is the Israeli leadership. The Israeli leadership has been really very much trying to weaken the Palestinian Authority over the years. It has been very disinterested in the idea of any kind of Palestinian state, has promoted settlements and so on. So it's really hard to conceive of how the current leadership in Israel could contribute to this kind of solution where you have some kind of outcome in which the Palestinians have their own rule.
And Mark, any presence by Israel, military, which is something Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talked about with NBC over the weekend, I mean, they cannot have a presence at all in order for this to really move forward. Just got about 30 seconds left here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The interesting thing is that early on, after October 7th, one thing that Israeli officials said, the one thing we're clear on is we don't want to be there to occupy for the long term. So this is actually a change where Israel has said we need to be there for the long term.